Welcome to the Tropic Zone. This is your host, Andrew Scarrett. The Tropic Zone is a weekly podcast of arts, culture, and politics from across the African diaspora. Our aim is to inform, entertain, provoke, and inspire. We will bring you the voices of those who are making a difference in the communities where they live, work, and play. Whether that's in Accra, Ghana, Port of Spain, Trinidad, Hackney, London, or Brooklyn, New York. We will bring you conversations with authors and poets, actors and activists whose work move and inspire us. We will also share listener feedback. But most of all, the Tropic Zone is a journey as well as a destination. Come and take the journey with us. This is the Tropic Zone. I am your host, Andrew Scarrett. Today on the Tropic Zone, our guest is journalist and author Edwin L. Martin. A native of the island of Montserrat, Martin is a former sports editor with the Miami Herald. His career at the Herald has spanned 2 decades, from 1986 to 2016. A year after he left the Herald, Martin fulfilled one of his lifelong dreams, and he's published his first book, Stranded Batsman, about the life and career of Montserrat's most storied cricketer, Jim Allen. I had the pleasure of helping to edit that groundbreaking work. Martin is also the author of A Century of Montserrat Cricket, an exhaustive look at the Montserrat cricket teams that competed in the Leeward Islands cricket tournament from 1913 till 2021. Martin is also the founder and publisher of Montserrat Spotlight, a website featuring well-researched articles about historical figures and events on Montserrat. One of those historical figures is the reason for his first visit to the Tropic Zone today. We will remember Alford Corriette, one of the most talented international cricketers to emerge from Montserrat during the 1970s. Corriette died recently. I'm going to do that. We do that. One of the historical figures is the reason for Martin's first visit to the Tropic Zone. We will remember Alford Corriette, one of the most talented international cricketers to emerge from the island of Montserrat during the early 1970s. Corriette died recently in Brooklyn at age 74. Welcome, Martin. Welcome to the Tropic Zone.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
And it's such a delight because I've been such a great admirer of your work, and I think it's we'd love to hope this is the first of many visits to the Tropic Zone. To understand the context of our conversation, our listeners need to know that before cable and the internet made globalization local, cricket was the sport of choice for West Indian boys. I use the term West Indian on purpose because it refers to the British-speaking Caribbean islands that make up the West Indies cricket team: Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, the Windward Islands, and the Leeward Islands. We lived and breathed cricket in the 70s. We played cricket during every spare daylight hour. We played cricket on any level piece of land, of asphalt, of any blade of grass or patch of dirt that could facilitate a bouncing ball. And, we played cricket with anything: a lemon, a lime, a grapefruit, an orange, a small breadfruit, even a coconut if we got desperate. Mm-hmm. And any piece of wood, any tree branch could make a cricket bat.
Yes.
Welcome.
Absolutely. And for anyone of a certain age, they can recall those years where, they say that necessity is the mother of invention, And so we couldn't afford proper cricket balls back in those days. And so we had to find the next best thing. And like you said, it could be a swivel sweet, could be a lime, anything. And in those days, and the reason why I wrote these books is because those days are still precious to me, because like you said, in those days, we didn't have cable, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have many alternative sports. Yeah, we had netball and maybe soccer to an extent, but cricket was everything. And so cricket was the one thing that mobilized Montserratians. We talked about Alford Corriette just passing. Another famous sports figure who just passed was Pele. And I've been watching a lot of documentaries on him since he passed away. And I heard that he was so popular at one point that there was a war going on in one of those African countries, and they actually had a ceasefire so they could watch the Brazilian team. So perhaps cricket wasn't to that magnitude, in Montserrat and some of the other islands, but it was the lifeblood, and it really brought the community together. And so, times have changed, and this segues back to Alford Corriette and what he meant to Montserrat, along with Jim Allen in that decade of the 70s. They were more than just cricketers. They were sort of like, I don't know, they were people who mobilized the community, people that they were people that the community members looked up to, rooted for. And I think, when the Montserrat team was playing, everybody, regardless whatever social class you came from, everybody was rooting for that team. And so at that point, there was no class structure or whatever. Everybody just wanted the team to win. And I think that was what made him important. And so Alford Corriette, definitely, along with Jim Allen, was the top cricketer for Montserrat in the 1970s. And his career was pretty short. He only played from 1970 to 1976, and he left in his prime. And that's another important aspect, because he left right smack dab in his prime, and he never returned to the game. And he said many years later that he had no regrets. So it's a sort of a complicated, a sort of a tawdry tale, as they would say,
What made Alford Corriette stand out as a cricketer? What was he good at?
I think what made him stand out was not only his talent on the field, was his personality as well. He was a very handsome guy. He was popular with the ladies. He was a very clean-cut guy. He came from a Catholic family, grew up in George Street. And, he was, I spoke to a lot of his former teammates, and he was a unique guy. Not only just talented on the field, he was a great all-rounder. For those who might not be the biggest cricket fans, an all-rounder means someone who is equally talented in batting, bowling, and fielding. Some cricketers are just good in one area, but he was good in all areas. And he was, I've talked to a lot of people who are very astute. I've talked to a lot of experts in Montserrat cricket history, and they all agree that Alford Corriette is the greatest all-rounder in Montserrat history. He, along with Jim Allen, made it as far as the Combined Islands cricket team. And in those days, the Combined Islands was just one step away from joining the West Indies team, which at that time was so prestigious, very difficult to get on if you were from the small island. And so, as a testament to their talent, Corriette's talent, he made it to the Combined Islands team and also hit a century for them. And that shows you how close he was to making this iconic West Indies team. So, like I said, it wasn't just his talent. It was his personality that made him stand out.
Okay, for those who are not familiar with the Combined Islands, talk about a little bit about the geography and the geopolitics of West Indies cricket, in terms of because we know for decades the people from Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Guyana made up the West Indies team.
Exactly. So what happened over time is that I think there was a long time where cricket in the small islands was viewed as being inferior. If you were from the Windward Islands or the Leeward Islands, it's very difficult to get on the West Indies team. And so you had basically the West Indies team was comprised of Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Guyana, and then the Windward Islands and the Leeward Islands. And every year they would compete in a tournament called the Shell Shield Tournament. And usually the outstanding performers in the Shell Shield were selected to the West Indies team. The Combined Islands was formed, I think it was actually formed for the first time, maybe sometime in the late 40s. But later on, like in the 60s, it came back. The Combined Islands, the whole concept behind it was they wanted to assemble the best cricketers from the Leeward Islands and the Windward Islands to form a consolidated team, because they felt that would be more of a competitive team to go up against the Trinidad, the Barbados team, the Guyanas, and the Jamaica. So that's what it was, because I guess some felt the Leeward Islands and Windward Islands competing as separate units would not be as competitive against those other teams. So someone like Corriette or Jim Allen in those days, they would have to make the Montserrat team, their national team. Then they would have to make the Leeward Islands team, and then the Combined Islands team. So whereas if you were from Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, or Guyana, you had a great series, bam, you were on the West Indies team. That was the only next step up. So you could see that the road was a lot more treacherous if you were from a small island in those days.
And the Windward Islands, we're talking Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent,
Dominica.
and Dominica, the Leeward Islands, Montserrat, Antigua, Barbuda, St. Kitts, Nevis, and yes, and so clearly, Corriette emerged from one of the even small islands, because Montserrat population back then was about 10 or 12,000 people, if that many.
Correct. Yes. And so, for him he emerged, and he made his debut for the national team in 1970. And he was from Plymouth. He grew up in Plymouth in the heart of town and George Street. And he emerged and quickly, I think in 2 years, he was on the Leeward Islands team. And then that same year, he had a great 1972 season. The Montserrat team almost won the Shield, which is the Leeward Islands Shield that year, but that's another story. And he and Jim Allen both made the Leeward Islands team. And 1973 was the big year for Alford Corriette. He had a really, really great season. And one of the highlights of 1973 was the Australia test team. The Australia cricket team came to the West Indies to play the West Indies in a series of test matches. Now, usually before they start those test matches, they play some warm-up matches. And one of those warm-up matches was against the Leeward Islands, Australia versus the Leeward Islands in Antigua. The Leeward Islands team that year actually had 4 monstrations on there. That tells you how strong Montserrat was at the time. Jim Allen, Alford Corriette, George Allen, who was Jim's brother, and opening batsman Vendell Moore. 4 monstrations on the team. And of course, there are no video recordings of this match. It's all about hearsay and people who went to the match talk about what a great match it was. Australia had a dangerous fast bowler named Dennis Lilly. Probably the best bowler in the world at that time. He intimidated people. He was a very wily, very, very, very shrewd guy. And the match started. Leeward Islands batted first, and Lilly summarily bowled down 2 Leeward Islands guys like nothing. And
okay, Edwin, before you delve further into that story, I want to reintroduce you to our audience. We're listening to the Tropic Zone, and we're listening to journalist and author Edwin Martin. We're remembering Alford Corriette, one of the most talented cricketers to emerge from the Caribbean island of Montserrat. Corriette died in Brooklyn at the age of 74, and for many years he sort of lived a pretty reclusive life, but his exploits on the cricket pitch live on in the memories of Montserrat folks and people from the Leeward and Windward Islands. So we thought it would be great to remember him because, as we know, cricket, love the cricket, was as integral to our upbringing in the Caribbean during the 60s and 70s and the years before. So again, welcome. So you were saying about what happened with Corriette and Lilly. And Lilly was fearsome. They actually made calypso songs about him.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It was Thompson and Lilly were the 2 feared Australian fast bowlers. Thompson was not there that day, though. I think he might have been injured or something. And so Lilly had a lot of the Leeward Islands batsmen intimidated, and Corriette, he usually bats around 5th or 6th in the lineup. So by the time he came in, Leeward Islands, I think, were something like maybe 60 for 5 or something. I don't remember. They were in deep trouble. And Corriette settled down and scored 81 runs. And I didn't get to speak to him. I didn't get to interview him directly. But in 2016, through an intermediary, he said that was the proudest moment of his career. That the mighty Australians came to the West Indies and he scored 81 runs against them. He led top scored for the Leeward Islands. Another point I wanted to make, the fact that the Combined Islands, and like you said, the Combined Islands team, you have 8 different islands that were eligible to send players to the Combined Islands team. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, Montserrat, Antigua, St. Kitts, and Nevis at that time. And to have 2 monstrations on that team was an immense, was a tremendous source of pride for the island, And so that goes to show you, that it was a testament to their talent that 2-month stretch-ins made that team, where 8 players from 8 different islands are eligible. And so that was a source of pride, and then Corriette and Jim Allen were part of that. And like you said, you alluded to earlier, he did become a bit of a recluse. Some of his teammates spoke about the fact that he was a bit aloof. He basically was a great player. He was a great teammate, from what I understand, but he could be a little unpredictable, and he could be a little, he was very meticulous. He didn't like, he would have his bats specially made. He would have like 5 different uniforms, whereas, those guys would be lucky to have 1 or 2 different change of clothes. And so he was a very meticulous person and unique in his own way. But his talent was undeniable. And like I said, he left the game when he was 27 years old. Who knows what might have been? He stayed on, he might have eventually made the West Indies team. Who knows? So his story is one of many, many different aspects. It's one of talent. It's one of mystery. It's one of, many lingering questions, And so that's what makes his life very interesting. And now that he's gone, unfortunately, a lot of those unanswered questions have gone to the grave with him,
Yes,
so it's a strange dynamic in a way.
Yes, and that's why I think it's important for us to remember him, because so much about his exploits are in our memory, and that's the only place they exist. And we really appreciate the work you've done. We sort of remembering him. I'm not sure if we've got enough time, but I know that you mentioned Corriette in your book, and in your Jim Allen book, and sort of feature. If you can read just a couple of minutes.
Absolutely. I've picked out a couple of excerpts here that I think might be a little interesting. Here's the first one. In 1976, in the prime of his career at age 27, Alford Corriette abruptly retired from cricket. It was a stunning setback for the Montserrat team, which had relied on Corriette's consistent medium pace, solid batting, and reassuring presence in the middle of the lineup for 6 years. Corriette never publicly announced why he quit. Speaking through an intermediary 4 decades later, he said only that he stopped playing because, quote, "it was time and I have no regrets." But many suspect a big reason was his rivalry with Jim Allen, which was fueled not necessarily by the players themselves, but by their supporters. That's one little excerpt. Another excerpt I like to read was Alford Corriette was one of 8 siblings, and he was the only boy. And I've interviewed one of his sisters, and she admitted to me that growing up that he was a bit of a pampered child. He was spoiled. He was the only boy. And she said, my parents adored him. And I wanted to read a little section about his father, because the father adored his son. Corriette's father's name was Charles. Corriette had a protective and proud father who addressed his son affectionately as Ali for Alford, Charles Corriette once attended one of Alford's matches at Sturge Park, and after overhearing spectators criticizing his only son, he vowed never to return again. When Alford would post a big score, his father would caution him against overconfidence. Ali, he would say, mind the head, mind the head. When Alford would get out for a duck, which is 0 in cricket vernacular, his father would console him with words of wisdom. Quote, "Look at it this way, you can't go any lower than naught," he would tell his son. Corriette and Jim Allen quickly became the undisputed best cricketers on Montserrat. Like Ronaldo and Messi, they were compared constantly. Young boys at play idolized them and argued about who would be Jim and who would be Corriette. As far as how the 2 stars got along, that's complicated.
Thank you for reading that and really appreciate it. And again, Corriette was definitely he represented the best of us. And Robert Lipsyte, in writing his introduction to Beyond the Boundaries, the classic by Sailor James, says that cricket heroes are not just entertainers. Mm-hmm. They seem to offer promise and possibility. And Alford Corriette, when he was at the pitch, he offered immense possibility. And I remember the poetry and the grace of his work as a cricketer. And coming from the smallest of small islands, he made us feel big. He made us feel proud. And I really appreciate you spending the time honoring him. And for people who want to know more about Corriette, where can they get a copy of your book?
Well, my book, Stranded Batsman, is available on Amazon. They could get it either through Amazon.com, which is in the US, or Amazon.co.uk, I think is in England. And yeah, it's available there. And there's a whole chapter on Alford Corriette, talking about his relationship, his life, his talent, and also his relationship with the main subject of the book, which is Jim Allen. So they could read it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think you sort of given life to Alford Corriette in a wonderful. Thanks for joining us. We're on the Tropic Zone. This is your host, Andrew Scarrett. And with us is author and journalist Edwin L. Martin. And Edwin has been doing some remarkable chronicling of the history and life of Montserrat. Even as somebody who no longer lives in Montserrat, he's got the finger on the pulse of cultural and historical issues affecting Montserrat, his native country. And one of the things he's done in the last years is an important project, Terror in Town Hill, to mark the 50th anniversary. We're on the Tropic Zone. This is your host, Andrew Scarrett. And with us is author and journalist Edwin L. Martin. And Edwin has been doing some remarkable chronicling of the history and life of Montserrat. Even as somebody who no longer lives in Montserrat, he's got the finger on the pulse of cultural and historical issues affecting Montserrat, his native country. And one of the things he's done in the last years is an important project, Terror in Town Hill, to mark the 50th anniversary of one of the most sensational murders in Montserrat history. It's a sort of case that would make, is it Death in Paradise? Would make an episode for that. And from 1972. Edwin, talk about that series that you did, Terror in Town Hill. How did you learn about it, and what made you want to revisit it all these years later?
Well, when the actual murder took place, I was probably around 4 or 5 years old. And believe it or not, I still remember hearing the adults talking about it. And then all these years later, I would hear people, hey, anybody remember when, this young girl got murdered? And, and people who remember it, would bring it up every now and then and talk. I never really heard the whole story. I never knew the whole story. And doing my research, because whenever I go to Montserrat, I do research, I go through the old newspapers. And a few years ago, I was down there in the library and I came across the old newspaper of when the murder took place. And in 2022, I realized to myself, wow, it's been 50 years since that murder. And I said to myself at that point, you know what? I'm going to try to research and find out all the information I can about what transpired, because the way people spoke about it, you could tell it had a profound effect on the island. But I just never knew all the information. So last year, 2022, I took it upon myself to do the research. I was fortunate that the victim, her mother is still alive. She's 84 years old now. Her sister is still around. And a lot of the people who lived in Town Hill at the time, many of them have migrated. They live in the diaspora. I spoke to many of them. And the more I spoke to them, I realized how much of a landmark and historic event this was. And so I decided I wanted to get to the bottom of it. And that's what I did. And so it took a lot of research. I had to speak to family. I spoke to friends. I had to go back, contact the registry in Montserrat and get the case files, the old case files. That took a while because they were buried somewhere, all these years. So I got the old case files and was able to speak to a couple of the police officers who investigated that case, who are still around, thank God. And so I came up with this really interesting story. Originally, I wanted to make it one story, but then it's sort of like going down a rabbit hole. I realized there were so many dynamics to this case that I broke it up into 4 different stories. And after I wrote the first one and published it on Montserrat Spotlight, my website, I was besieged with messages with people, especially younger people, saying, when are you going to do part 2? What happened? They were just intrigued. I couldn't believe that something like this could happen on a small, tranquil, peaceful island like Montserrat, And so I ended up doing 4 parts, and it was unbelievable because it sort of had, the reaction was all over the place. I got emails, private messages from people who said, who were maybe even a little upset with me, saying that the way I wrote it, it brought back all those memories rushing back about that, how terrible that time was. And then some people were, they said, listen, I'm glad you wrote about this. It's an important part of Montserrat history. And even though it's not the most pleasant story to talk about, it's part of our history and it's something we could learn from. So it really conjured a different an array of emotions. And so I would say that it's probably the most important piece I've written in my career.
Well, I want to thank you for doing that piece, because that incident was one of the seminal events of my life, because I was an 8-year-old at the time. I knew the victim, and where the body was found was someplace that I traversed quite a bit. And during my boyhood, I think that incident was a dividing line between safety and terror, where before that you'd walk wherever you wanted to walk and you weren't afraid. You didn't look over your shoulders. But after that incident in the summer of 1972, you didn't walk at night the same way anymore. You ran. If you're walking at night, if you can run, you're running.
Yes.
And each street light was a sanctuary, because all of a sudden the night held terror. What happened in the summer of 1972? What happened?
Well, it's a long story, but to put it in a nutshell, a 16-year-old girl was murdered. And for people who aren't familiar with Montserrat, yes, there have been murders in Montserrat before that, but they've been very few and far between. And the murders that took place before this one in 1972, they happened during arguments, different things like that. They weren't mysteries. They weren't what you would call a whodunit. But this case was different. Here was a young girl, a petite young girl named Sarah Mead. They called her Mun. She lived in Town Hill with her family. She was a tremendous athlete. She was a sprinter, and she actually represented her school, represented Montserrat regionally in St. Kitts in a tournament, and actually won the mile race. She was a tremendous athlete. And one day she just ends up missing, and they searched for about 3 days, and finally they found her body, probably about maybe a half a mile from where she lived, in some bushes. She had already started to decompose, and it was just a terrible incident that Montserrat was not accustomed to, anything this heinous. And it really shook up not only just the Town Hill area, but all of Montserrat, because, like I said, for those who aren't familiar with the island, it's a tranquil, peaceful island. Like you said, people weren't afraid to walk at night. I made an analogy in the stories that people in Montserrat used to say that they were more afraid of the dead than the living. We were more afraid of ghosts than, criminals. So this incident, like you said, was a turning point. It was a turning point. And then what made it even more significant were all the events that led up after the body was found. The subsequent arrests of the suspect, and then the trial, which ended up with the main judge, dying on the day that the verdict was announced. And so all these different dynamics, and you have talks about black magic and and different things and all kind of nefarious things started to come about. And then, there was like a bungled attempt to dispose of the young girl's body by the suspect. It was just an incredible case. And at one point you're like, am I reading like an Agatha Christie novel, or is this something that really happened in a small British colony that's one of the most peaceful areas on earth? So that's what made it really, really a landmark story in Montserrat history.
That it was, and also you were able to find a lot of the records online because the court records for the region are online. Again, I want to reintroduce you. I'm speaking with Edwin Martin, a journalist and author. He's based in Miami, but his heart is in Montserrat, and we're talking about Terror in Town Hill, his recounting of a murder mystery from 1972 that rocked the island. As a matter of fact, the Mighty Arrow, whose work you've written about and spoken about, had a calypso, the Lasso Man. That sort of commemorates that event because and as Arrow was so well during our boyhood, he captured our terror. He captured it like nobody in a calypso. And if you haven't heard Lasso Man, go Google it because on YouTube, because it'll definitely be worth listening.
And it's and the Lasso Man song, when you listen to the lyrics, I mean, it sounds like some sort of mystery. He's talking about a man with a black heart book and how he hangs out in trees and he lassos his victims and it's just it was just an incredible time in Montserrat, and I just as the more I learned about it, I said I have to delve deeper into this, and and like I said, the reaction has been tremendous because, like I said, a lot of people up to this day still can't believe that something like that really happened in Montserrat, and then also I sort of cap it off by talking about where the main figures are now. Many of them have passed on, including the main suspect. And I like the fact that I ended it with a quote by the victim's sister, where she says that we do forgive, but we could never forget, So yeah, it was just a tremendous case. And sometimes as a writer, and you could probably, you could sort of understand this, you become emotionally connected to the subject you're writing about. Because this is my island,
Yes.
So, it's sort of like it becomes personal in a way. So it was just like I said. I think it's definitely the most important piece I've done in my career.
Well, I'm really grateful for you to tackle it because, like I said, that was a seminal time in my life. And I remember after the body was found, it was not far from where the government house is. And whenever we were walking by, you'd start running at the top of the hill, and I wouldn't stop running until I hit the light at the intersection about 100 yards away. So so it was definitely a scary time, and it really changed our childhood because it was a sort of end of innocence because something like that could happen. And I remember being a young boy thinking up at night, how could anybody do anything that vicious and live with themselves and their conscience not be affected? But the person who was convicted, he was released from prison and after a while, wasn't he?
I think he spent about 18 years in jail. And I think there's some strange English law. There's some strange British law that 18 years, I think, is technically considered a life sentence. I couldn't really get into the nuances of the law, but he was actually released because he participated in a Bible ministry. There were some Adventist folks who visited him in jail, counseled him. Also they took into account good behavior. Apparently, the suspect, while he was in jail, he was a very talented artist. He would they say he would look out the jail cell at the ships, and he would do like model ships, build them, and things like that. and they would sell them to tourists and different things like that. So he eventually did get released and actually started a family of his own. Wow. And worked. From what I understand, from my understanding, I don't think he got into any more trouble after that. But people were still definitely afraid of him. And a lot of people thought it was quite unfair that he took someone's life and now he got a new lease on life, so to speak. And he eventually migrated during the volcanic years in the mid-90s. He ended up in Tortola and, he eventually suffered a stroke and passed away down there. So he got, you say like a decade or so after, life that this young lady was robbed of at age 16, So it's tremendous, I mean, I think it also raises the question about forgiveness, should someone like that be forgiven? And I've talked to people who said, look, I've struggled with my Christian values. I mean, about forgiveness and different things like that, because I knew the victim. I knew what the family went through. How can I forgive someone who did something so heinous? And from what I understand, to his dying day, he insisted that he didn't do it. He told some of his closest friends that he didn't do it. So it's a mystery. It's an unbelievable case.
That it was, and we really appreciate you sharing it with us. Again, you're listening to the Tropic Zone. This is your host, Andrew Scarrett, and my guest is Edwin L. Martin, author, website publisher, storyteller, chronicler, journalist, passionate Montrealian, and avid cricket fan. And Edwin, really thank you for joining us today on the Tropic Zone. We hope to have you back sometime in the future, because you're always doing some groundbreaking work. And thanks again, and it was a real delight for you to tell us about Alford Corriette and also about Terror in Town Hill. Really appreciate it.
If I could leave you with one little quote I like to say is that life should not only be lived, it should be documented. And so I'll leave it right there.
Thank you, Edwin. Really appreciate it. And again, thank you for joining us on the Tropic Zone. This is your host, Andrew Scarrett.
Thank you.